would like to thank our seminar supporter, Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America, for supporting this seminar. We would not be able to provide these educational programs without the support of our generous partners. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first session of the day, BrainGate, Brain-Computer Interfaces for the Restoration of Communication and Functional Independence for People with Paralysis. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Rubin. He is a neurologist and researcher at Massachusetts General Hospital and an instructor in neurology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Rubin joined the BrainGate team in 2019, and his research interests are focused on understanding the dynamics of neural coding to develop electrophysiologic biomarkers and tools to facilitate recovery after acute and chronic neurologic injury. Dan received his MD and his PhD in computational neuroscience from Columbia University, studying circuit mechanisms of information processing in mammalian cortex, and completed his neurology residency and neurocritical care fellowship at Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. So thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Rubin. I will now go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marissa. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I will share my screen. Right. I'm going to stop sharing and share it again, this time with the sound. Even better. Looks about the same. And let's go to presenter mode. Slideshow. Here we go. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. As Marissa said, my name is Dan Rubin. I'm a neurologist at General Hospital and a researcher with the BrainGate team. And we are studying brain-computer interfaces for the restoration of communication and functional independence for people with paralysis. I'll start off again by thanking Marissa and the MDA team for inviting me to present, and to all of you for coming to listen. Briefly, these are our disclosures. So we have no financial interest at a personal level, but we are funded by a number of wonderful foundations, philanthropies, and federal funding sources, which are listed here. So what is BrainGate? Well, I'll be spending most of this talk telling you what BrainGate is, but it's helpful to start off by describing why BrainGate is. What is our goal behind BrainGate, and really the whole field of brain-computer interfaces in general? And they're actually pretty straightforward. Our goals are to be able to tell people with muscular dystrophy, ALS, other neuromuscular disorders and diseases that cause weakness, that no matter how weak you get, you will never lose the ability to communicate easily and fluently. Come back to that. For people who yesterday could communicate without difficulty, but then suffer a brainstem stroke or have some other condition that causes locked-in syndrome, we want to be able to tell them that they'll be able to communicate easily again tomorrow. Not 3 months from now, not a year from now, but tomorrow. And for people who've had spinal cord injuries or other types of stroke that cause weakness, we want to be able to tell them that they'll be able to move again tomorrow. Now, we're not quite there yet, but I think that over the course of this talk, I'll be able to show you we're getting ever closer to achieving these goals. So how do we do that? Well, we do that with a brain-computer interface. And what I want to lay out on this slide is something that all brain-computer interfaces, what I'll be talking about, what Dr. Milan will be talking about in the next talk, all have in common. And all brain-computer interfaces really share the same basic design architecture. There's 3 components. There's a sensor. There's some sort of electrical device placed in, on, or near the brain that picks up on the electrical activity of the brain, independent of whether or not any movement actually occurs or can occur, depending on what sort of injury or weakness the user has. Now, when thinking about what sensor to use, there's a lot of design considerations. What type of sensor are you going to use? Are you going to use a sensor that's implanted under the skull, like we do in BrainGate, which is to say a chronically permanently implanted sensor, or are you going to use something that's placed on the surface of the scalp and that can come on and off every day? Each has their advantages and disadvantages. What part of the brain are you going to try and listen to? And as you're listening to electrical activity, what type of signal are you going to pay attention to? the brain cells that we're concerned with give off lots of different types of signals. There are these large high amplitude spikes or action potentials that are believed to contain a lot of information, but there's also other types of electrical signals that can be monitored and used. These are important decisions that need to be made. The next major component, and this is true again for all brain-computer interfaces, is the decoder, which is a fancy way of saying the mathematical equations that turn brain activity into some intended movement. And here I've represented all of this with a single equation with a couple of symbols, but truthfully, the decoder these days is typically comprised of thousands of lines of computer code doing complex computations that really we spent the better part of 20 years figuring out and are ever improving. And then the third part is the technology that you pair that decoder with. So you listen to the brain activity, you figure out how to translate the neural code, the electrical activity in brain cells, into a control signal that can be used for one of really any different type of assistive technology that you can imagine. And this, to some extent, is the fun part of this work, is we've decoded the brain's activity. How can we use this to help people? And so this can be things like typing or surfing the internet or controlling assistive devices like robots, wheelchairs, and other technology. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how we've been using the BrainGate system to do that. But this is the basic framework for any BCI. And then we're really not there yet, but there's this dream of closing the loop and being able to use input to the sensor as a form of neuromodulation to help with neural recovery. Call that the next generation of BrainGate. We're not there yet. So what type of sensor do we use in BrainGate? So in BrainGate, as I alluded to earlier, we use an intracortical microelectrode array. I've shown you one of them here. It's basically a microchip, about 4 by 4 millimeters, smaller than a Lincoln Memorial on the back of a penny, with 100 individual electrodes. And each of these electrodes is 1.5 millimeters long. You can see them here under a scanning electron microscope. So we're talking really microscopic little sensors. And the thing about them, if you look over here on the left, is that they're so small that they can sit right next to individual brain cells. And that's what you're seeing under a microscope slide here. And so we're able to listen to the activity of individual cells, clusters of single numbers of cells, as well as the LFP, which is the local field potential, the electrical signal that they generate all together in that region. And this is really important, and an important part of the work we're able to do is that we're able to listen to brain cells at this very, very high spatial resolution. And when the BrainGate system is working the way it's supposed to, the whole thing kind of looks like this. And so here's a cartoon example. So as I mentioned, we've got that 100 microelectrode array. Here we're showing just one, although typically we now use anywhere from 2 to 4 of these. More brain cells equals more precise control over whatever it is we're controlling. The array itself is placed by a neurosurgeon on the surface of the brain in the area of the brain that controls movement, the motor cortex. It's attached by a bundle of micro wires to a small percutaneous pedestal. That's this bit here. This is the part that actually sticks up through the skin, and when the BrainGate technology is being used, sends the signal over to a rack of computers. You can see a rack of computers here, that then decode the signal and turn them into, well, again, pretty much anything. So in this example, this cartoon BrainGate user is using the BrainGate system to control this blue cursor and is presumably being tasked to play some video game where you move the cursor to certain targets. And again, this is a cartoon. We don't actually play this particular video game, but it's the general idea of how it works. So this user in this cartoon is theoretically someone who's got some form of paralysis, cannot move his arms or legs, but can think about moving his arms and legs. And in doing so, we can listen to the brain's activity and allow him to control the cursor. And I'll show you a bit more about how that works in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to briefly describe the clinical trial structure that allows us to do this research. So everything I'm going to show you for the remainder of this talk is from real participants in our BrainGate neural interface system clinical trial. So this is a clinical trial. It has inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and individuals enroll to help us study the BrainGate system and make it better so that we can develop technology to help people with paralysis. So in order to be eligible to enroll in the trial, participants must have advanced paralysis, and so we've defined that precisely as limited use of their hands and or severe dysarthria, that is an inability to speak clearly, due either muscular dystrophy, motor neuron disease like ALS, spinal cord injury, or certain types of stroke. Participants have to be adults. For people who've had a spinal cord injury or stroke, We require that there be a year from injury, because a lot of recovery can happen over that first year. We wouldn't want to enroll someone who then makes a full recovery without us because they wouldn't need our help. People must be able to communicate and otherwise be healthy enough to undergo the surgery that's involved in placing the device, and must live within 3 hours of one of our study sites. And the reason for this last requirement is that all of the research that occurs after the device is placed actually occurs in our participants' homes. So if they live at home, we come to them. If they live in a long-term care facility, we come to there. But basically, once someone enrolls in the trial, has the device placed, the rest of the research, which occurs over a year, happens in their home. And the reason for that is that we're studying this technology to be used in the home. And so it doesn't make sense for us to be doing tests in a hospital or university lab. We need to be testing the technology in the place where it's going to be used. If there is anyone on this seminar who is interested in potentially joining us, we are actively clinical study sites that you have to live within 3 hours of are in Boston, Providence up in New England, Palo Alto and Sacramento in California, and Atlanta in Georgia. And I'll come back to this a little bit towards the end. An important part of this research, I mean, it is a clinical trial, as I said, but it's not a clinical trial the way a lot of people, I think, often think of clinical trials, where you enter a study, you're randomized to either get a placebo or a drug, and then a year later you look at the outcome. Now, this is really what we call patient-centered research, a type of translational research, where we're really focusing on developing tools to help people. That's what it comes down to. And so, in keeping with being patient-centered, we have broadly defined inclusion criteria. So, as I mentioned, we've got a number of conditions that are eligible to be enrolled. And in fact, if you don't meet those criteria, we can often extend them depending on the circumstances. There's no placebo group, so everyone who joins our clinical trial has a device placed. There's no sham surgeries or anything like that. Importantly, the trial, so when you run a trial with the FDA or the NIH, they always ask, well, how long is the trial going to last for? And you have to give them a number. And so formally, after someone enrolls in the trial, they are a part of the primary outcome group for 1 year, and we monitor lots of different parameters during that first year. However, at the end of that 1 year period, many people tell us, I really like this technology. I want to keep using it. I don't want to stop using it. We say, well, that's fine. You can keep enrolling. And in fact, we're able to renew people every 5 years at the end of 1 year, and then every 5 years after that. And we've had people who've worked with us for over 5 years, a couple of people actually, because they find the BrainGate technology works better than other forms of assistive technology that we're using. Importantly, and this comes up a lot in neuromuscular disease in particular, people with advanced disease are not excluded. So certain small molecule trials, for example, will often exclude people with advanced disease because the goal of the small molecule study is to try and prevent disease progression, and you can't test that on people who've already got advanced disease. But here, that's not our goal, and so we've enrolled people who use a ventilator 24/7 and are basically completely locked in. And they're still able and welcome to join us, and I'll show you some videos of that in a moment. And again, something that makes us very patient-centered is that all research occurs in the participant's home. So other than that one visit to the hospital to have the device placed, all the rest of the research happens in our participant's home on their schedule, typically 2 research sessions a week, and we come to the home at convenient times, and we would do different research sessions using the technology. I'm going to try, I saw there were some chats, some questions that came up in the chat. I'll take a peek here. But if they're going to be longer answers, I may answer them towards the end. All right, I will come back to those questions at the end. I think it'll be easier once we go through everything, but I'll keep an eye on it. And Sarah or Marissa, if there's something, because I can't really monitor the chat too well, if you want to pause me for any questions that come up that seem germane to answer during the talk, please do, and I'll be happy to. So, right, and then lastly, our research has emphasized our participants' priorities. So people join the trial and they say, what are we doing during these bi-weekly research sessions? And we say, well, sort of whatever you want. And then it's a bit of an extreme answer. There are some research objectives that we have, things about improving the decoders we use, optimizing the different equations that we use for controlling for example, a computer cursor using brain activity. But a lot of what we do is based on what our participants tell us. If our participants say, you know, communication is very, very challenging for me, and it takes me a long time using, for example, an eye gaze system to write one letter at a time. Well, maybe this person's priority is communication. I'll show you some communication tools we've developed to make that more efficient. For other people who maybe don't have communication difficulties but have mobility impairment, well, then maybe their priorities are things to improve mobility, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. And our research sessions really try to cater to what our participants think they could use this technology for, because at the end of the day, that's who we're developing it for. So an example of how this works, and then we'll get into some of these more concrete areas of our efforts. So the idea is something like this, and if you're listening and the volume's working, you probably hear something that sounds a little bit like a radio tuned stations. Anyone who still uses a radio that tunes the car, sounds kind of like static electricity. But it's not static electricity. Those are actually the firing of brain cells in the motor cortex. And importantly, this is in the motor cortex of someone who has advanced ALS. This is someone who's unable to talk or move their arms or legs. But when asked to think about moving his arm, that's the activity of the brain cells in his motor cortex, which tells us, this is an important thing to know, that even with advanced ALS, when someone's nearly completely paralyzed, their motor cortex, the part of the brain that thinks about an issue, still is healthy, is firing. Again, these action potentials, these electrical signals that brain cells use to communicate with each other. And when we ask that participant, I'll show you the video a little bit larger, same video, it was in the bottom corner. This is that same participant, and he's being asked to think about moving his hand in different directions as if he was holding a joystick for a computer, and will decode what he thinks about doing with his hand and turn it into control of that computer cursor. And so he's not able to move his hand, but he's able to think about moving his hand, and the cursor goes where he thinks about moving it. Now, you can tell by the sort of quality of the video and the look of the computer screen, this is pretty old. This is, I think, 2006 or so about 16 years old. Our technology's come quite a bit in that time. Computers have gotten faster, our equations have gotten better, our understanding of how the brain encodes movement has improved. So nowadays our system looks a bit more like this. This is another participant. This video too is 6 years old, so only 10 years newer. So here's a participant, another gentleman who also has ALS, is unable to speak or move his arms or legs, but can think about moving. And he's being asked to move that tiny white target to these red targets that can appear anywhere on this large screen. And then once he gets the white target to the red target, in order to click, he imagines squeezing his hand. And so we can decode a click, a discrete signal, in addition to a two-dimensional signal. And of course, you can imagine, if you can do that, if you can control a cursor on a screen and click where you want to click, well, then you can control a keyboard. And so for an individual who has no other way of communicating, this, of course, can be a life-changing intervention. Now, if you look at this screen, it's a little bit slow. He's typing, but it's not that quickly, maybe 5 to 10 characters per minute on a standard QWERTY keyboard. But we'll show you how to improve that in just a moment. Another thing I do want to point out, just because you can sort of see it well in this video, you look in the back of the computer screen, there's some artwork, there's a couch, there's another painting. And the reason for that is that this is all happening in our participant's home. So this is the computer screen that our participant is literally seeing in front of him as he's taking part in this research session. And that's a big part of this work, is that it happens in our participant's home. All right, so that's sort of just an example of the technology at work, but what are our actual goals? So number one, as I mentioned, was communication. So on the prior video, I showed you that someone with ALS who's unable to move his hands can think about moving his hands and control a computer cursor, and in doing so can type out letters on a keyboard. But in order for communication to be fast, we need to make it a bit more efficient. So one thing that we did was to improve the keyboard. Right? The QWERTY keyboard is a holdover from the days of typewriters, and if you just make a more efficient keyboard, put all the letters that are commonly used in the middle, letters that you don't use very often off to the side, repeat things that are used a lot, like the spacebar, you can actually get to type pretty quickly. So this is another participant who has advanced ALS, is unable to move her arms, but she can type almost 40 characters per minute using this optimized keyboard. And importantly, this doesn't use anything like word prediction or autocomplete, as many of you have probably experienced nowadays. If you're using a smartphone or Gmail app and you start writing a sentence, the computer can pretty accurately predict at least the word you're going to type, if not the whole sentence, depending on what sort of software you're using. But 40 characters per minute without any of those tools suggests that once you add those sort of common off-the-shelf tools into the equation, you're going to be able to communicate pretty fast. Now, one thing that our participants told us as we were doing these sort of these research sessions as well, it's really great to be able to type very quickly, and that's very nice. But what I really like to do is just use the computers that I used before I had ALS. You know, your typing interface is nice and all, but it's just typing. What if I want to send emails or surf the web? So we realized once we got really good at two-dimensional cursor control that we didn't need to make our own keyboards. We could just use the ones that were built into computers these days, and then use things like autocomplete. And so here are two research participants. In fact, they're the two participants who I've already shown you videos of. So this woman on the left is the woman who's controlling the keyboard in the prior video, and this gentleman on the right was from 2 videos ago, controlling the white cursor, searching for the red targets. They both have, as I mentioned, ALS. They both use ventilator 24/7, and I'll show you some videos. Here they are. Here they are controlling off-the-shelf Google Nexus tablets. So these are Google tablets you could buy on Amazon. We basically plug them into the output of the BrainGate device. They both have a sort of accessibility input that we just turn on. And then the BrainGate device basically becomes a universal mouse with some extra features. Because in addition to controlling direction, we can also decode different gestures, right? So tablets are made to be used with a single press for a click, and swipes and pinches for different control. And because we can add all of that, because we can decode the intended movement of our participants' hands, we can give people really full control over an off-the-shelf tablet computer. And so the participant on the left is writing an email to one of our researchers. The participant on the right is searching for a YouTube video. And the idea is basically that they're doing things that they could do before they had ALS, but then once they developed weakness, they otherwise couldn't. But here they are again. I do want to just point out, you'll see in both of these cases, they've got these large cables attached to the pedestals that are on the top of their head. We don't use these large cables anymore. These videos are a little bit old. But it does point out the participant on the left had one of those microelectrode arrays, and so it has one of these cable connectors. The participant on the right had 2, and so has 2, although the video just went dark on my screen. All right, so in thinking about communication, we thought to ourselves, all right, so we can optimize the keyboard, and that allows us to communicate a little bit faster. And we can just let people control off-the-shelf tablets, and that'll let them communicate faster. What can we do that's even faster? How do we approach really fluent rates of communication? So one approach that was thought up by our team at Stanford was, rather than giving someone two-dimensional cursor control to type on a keyboard, what if we tried to decode handwriting? And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if you look at the screen, you'll see what looks to be the English alphabet. And you could imagine that this could be the English alphabet that someone drew with, say, a stylus on a tablet or touchscreen computer. But in fact, these characters that you're seeing here that look, sort of more neat than my handwriting, were never actually drawn by anyone's hand, per se. Rather, they were decoded from the intended trajectory of the hand of one of our research participants. So one of our research participants with paralysis thought about holding a pen or pencil in his hand and thought about writing out the letters of the alphabet, and we listened to the activity of his motor cortex, of the brain cells that control the movement of the hand, and decoded where he intended to put the tip of that imaginary pencil. And in doing so, decoded the alphabet. Once we had a reliable code for his neural activity as it related to each of the letters of the alphabet, we could then turn that into a much more fluent way, or a much faster way, of decoding intended writing. So here's that participant I mentioned. He has a spinal cord injury, so he's unable to move his hands or his arms, but he can think about moving them. And here, he's imagining that he's writing out the sentence that's printed above in real time. And again, he's not actually writing it, but he's thinking about writing it. We're listening to the brain activity, and we're putting the letters that he's writing on the screen in real time. And you can see this is getting to be pretty fast. I'll let you watch it one more time without talking. The red versus the green square just lets you know when, if you will, the microphone is on, when we're actually listening to the neural activity. And so for anyone who's used things like eye gaze software or other assistive technology for communicating letter by letter, you'll see this is pretty fast. Here he's just asked like an open-ended question, and he just writes out the answer. And using this, he's able to get a rate of about 90 characters per minute. Again, this is without autocomplete, without word prediction, and 90 characters per minute. To put that in perspective, because I didn't personally know what that was until I started working in this field, that's approaching about as fast as someone without paralysis can quickly type a message on a cell phone, on a smartphone, right? So if you see, the kids, if you will, sending quick text messages, that's in the neighborhood of 90 to 150 or so characters per minute. So we're getting about that fast, which again is pretty incredible. And again, would be transformative for someone who relies on some other form of assistive technology to communicate. So where do we go from here? How do we get even faster? Well, one big paradigm shift that we're exploring, everything I've shown you up until now is based on decoding the intended position of the hand. So we listen to the brain cells that control the movement of the hand, and then in doing so, we understand where the hand wants to be in space, and we use that for two-dimensional cursor control or for the handwriting control that I showed you a moment ago. But what if instead of listening to those brain cells, we listen to a different set of brain cells located about a centimeter or two away that control the muscles of the face, mouth, throat, tongue to decode what someone's intending to say in real time rather than what they're intending to do with their hand. So for our participants who have lost the ability to speak or lost the ability to speak clearly due to neuromuscular disease, stroke, muscular dystrophy, we can decode the intended speech directly from motor cortex. And what I'm showing you here, this is sort of just a lot of data, but the idea is that with this approach, members of our team have been able to decode the spoken phonemes with 85% accuracy. So what are phonemes? Phonemes are the individual sounds in the English language that are used to make up the syllables that make up words. So phonemes make up syllables that make up words. There's a vocabulary of some 42 to 46 phonemes, depending on how you classify them. And we can decode them pretty accurately just by listening to the words that someone says. And in doing that, once we start decoding individual phonemes, it's just a short jump to then string them together and start decoding entire words. And so here's some data that was recently gathered from one of our participants. You've seen this diagram just demonstrating where the neural activity is being recorded from. And this is just a plot showing the spiking activity of some brain cells every time a word is presented on a screen and a participant's asked to try and talk. We do some sophisticated mathematics on the neural activity, basically take a dimensional signal, shrink it down into a lower dimensional space, and in doing so, can decode when our participant is talking versus not talking with basically 100% accuracy, and can start to decode individual words based on differences in their sound with what is getting to be a better and better accuracy. This one still has a ways to go. 36% is not great, but it's still much, much more than chance. Chance in this particular exercise would be closer to 10%. So just based on the neural activity, we can start to predict what words someone is trying to say, combine this with things like word prediction and language models that are available, again, in most off-the-shelf word processing tools these days, and you can see how you'll be able to start communicating in near real time. And the goal here is to basically have someone be able to use this technology and have a real-time conversation, to be able to talk using this technology, having the words that they're trying to say or thinking about saying appear on a screen as quickly as I'm speaking right now. Or for someone who had progressive loss of speech, did something like voice banking. If someone, for example, with ALS or muscular dystrophy did voice banking, allow them to speak in their own voice in near real time using this sort of decoding algorithm. So that's communication. I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about another one of our big goals, and I'll be mindful of the time. We'll see if I get through all of my slides. I may or may not. So another big goal is mobility. So I'll set this up before I play it. For a lot of people that we work with, and there are a number of studies from groups of people with ALS, muscular dystrophy, and other related conditions, a big part of one's day-to-day quality of life is being able, at least we're told, is being able to do things for oneself and regaining independence. And for a lot of our research participants, that involves being able to do things with their arms that they couldn't previously do. So in this video, I'm going to show you this participant had a brainstem stroke, so she's unable to speak or move her arms or legs, and she's going to think about using her arms to pick up a thermos and take a drink. So let's play this video. Mind you, she hasn't used her arms to do something like this in a while, and so she's taking a little time to set it up. And you notice this is a giant metal robotic arm. One of our team members is sitting at the control station behind, but his only job is to push the stop button if something appears to be unsafe. He's not otherwise controlling the arm. She's controlling the arm. And she's lining it up, and she's going to bring it close to her. There. And she lines it up, and she's able to take a sip. And it's important to note that this is the first time that she's given herself something to eat or drink since her stroke, which occurred more than 10 years before this video was taken. She'd had a stroke about 9 years before she enrolled in the study, and this video happened, I think, around 3 years into her participation. So, over a decade went by between her stroke and her ability to feed herself something to eat or drink of her own volition. So she was pretty excited about this. We were pretty excited about this. In this next video, we take things to the next step. So I'm going to pause it for a moment and set up what you're seeing here. So in the prior video, the participant was controlling a robotic arm. One way to move this sort of technology forward for mobility is through a process called FES, functional electrical stimulation. And with FES, what one does, there's different types of FES, but at least in this type of FES, as I presume many of you know, but I'll just say we're on the same page. In someone who doesn't have paralysis or weakness, the way that the muscles contract is that they receive electrical stimulation, electrical signals through nerves that are carrying signals from the motor cortex. So normally signals go from the motor cortex through the spinal cord and out through the peripheral nerves into the muscles. And by firing little electrical signals, the muscles contract. Well, what we can do is we can pair the BrainGate device with an FES, a functional electrical stimulation system. So this participant who has a spinal cord injury and is unable on his own to move his arms or hand has a series of electrodes that are surgically implanted in his arm and forearm that are now under the control of the BrainGate device, such that when he thinks about raising his arms, it will send electrical impulses into the electrodes that are in his muscles and actually allow him to lift his arms. And so here, this participant is using the BrainGate technology to feed himself, I think it's either scrambled eggs or mashed potato. But the important thing is that he's lifting his arm and bending his arm in for the first time since his spinal cord injury many years prior to his enrollment in the BrainGate trial. And so he's doing this all on his own. That brace system that you see there is really just to keep his arm from falling in a direction that he can't control because he doesn't have control over all the small stabilizer muscles that we normally use. So that brace system there keeps his arm moving with a particular axis, but all the movement that you're seeing is generated by him. And then the most recent work that we've been doing with regard to restoring mobility involves something called soft robotics. So you saw this big rigid robotic arm in the first video, and those things are very big and heavy and rather expensive. They don't really scale. They're hard to move around. The FES system is very novel, but of course requires then a second surgery to implant the electrodes. So something we've been exploring that we think has a lot of promise is with soft robotics. So this is clothing that people with paralysis can put on, and inside the clothing are actually these little pneumatic actuators, these little balloons that inflate or deflate based on an electrical control signal that allow the generation of movement across joints. And so what you'll see in this video is one of our participants with paralysis wearing the robotic glove. And you'll see it looks kind of like a hockey glove, but instead of being filled with thick pads, it's those little balloons that are around each finger joint that allow movement at each finger joint as the participant thinks about moving. There's also a companion sleeve for the elbow that allows for elbow flexion and extension, and shoulder that allows for shoulder elevation and depression. But he's just wearing the glove right now, so you'll see this. So he normally can't move his hand, but he's thinking about closing his hand, the glove closes. He thinks about a neutral position, it goes to neutral. He thinks about opening, it opens up. He's going to pinch, because he's just sort of toggling through the different movements that we've enabled with this glove for him. And you can hear maybe in the background a little whirring sound, and that's the electrical motors going that actually inflate or deflate these balloons rapidly, allowing for these quick changes in movements. And then as a trial, we asked him, well, see if you can move some of these blocks. So in this video, he's trying to move these soft foam blocks. Because of the nature of his spinal cord injury, he's able to move his arms at the shoulders. He can't move his hands, though, you'll see. And so you'll see when he wants to move the blocks from his desk into that bin, he sort of just has to balance them on his fingers by pushing his left hand onto his right. But he doesn't have any power in the fingers. And so you can see it's a sort of frustrating task. But we did this with him to get sort of a baseline of how quickly he could move X number of blocks. And then he's doing it now with the glove. And this is the first time he's doing it, so he's sort of getting the hang of it. So he puts his hand over the block. He thinks about pinching. Pinches. He thinks about opening his hand. And once he's done the first one, he very quickly gets the hang of it. And you'll see he's able to move these things pretty quickly once he figures out how to do it. There you have it. All right, then independence. So what does independence mean? So independence means a couple things. One is the ability to communicate and the ability to move in ways that one couldn't previously move. But it's also important from a technological basis that we pare down the scope of these things. So one thing that's really been key to increasing the degree to which this technology can be used for independence is by making the system wireless. So everything you've seen up until now involved participants who had a wired connection between the percutaneous pedestal, that's this bit here at the bottom, and the computer system. But of course, it's 2022, there's no reason to use wires anymore. And so this is a wireless transmitter here that sits on the pedestal. To give you a sense of the scope, this is about, this flat part here looks kind of like a matchbook. And then this barrel area here has the diameter of a AA battery. It's a little bit shorter though. It's a medical grade AA, so it's half as long, same diameter though. So it's pretty small. It sits right on top of the percutaneous pedestal, and as soon as you put it on, you're going. You're now sending your neural signals wirelessly to the BrainGate decoding system, so you can use this on the go. You can use it, for example, in bed. So here's one of our research participants, and he's lying in bed. He's out of focus because the focus is on the tablet computer that he's got mounted in his room. But you can see he's got sort of a bright orange neck pillow. He's got the wireless transmitter here attached to the BrainGate pedestal, and he is controlling his tablet computer. And you're going to see he's got Pandora loaded, and he's going to play some music. And he's playing some music, and I'm going to have a little bit. And that's it. And you're going to say this is rather quotidian. This is just a guy playing Pandora, but that's the point, right? So this participant happens to live alone, and so after his PCA leaves for the day, he's generally on his own. And so things that we can do to give him more control over his environment are big when it comes to functional independence. For the sake of time, I'm going to breeze through the section on neuroscience, only to say briefly that by virtue of the fact that we work with participants who agreed to have the BrainGate device placed, and the BrainGate device again consists of these microelectrode arrays that are placed on the primary or supplementary motor cortex area. So motor cortex recording from single neurons or clusters of small neurons gives us the ability to answer some really fundamental neuroscientific questions that are unanswerable in other systems. So most of neuroscience, up until really the past 10, 15 years, has all been based on preclinical research, which is say animal studies. But animals aren't people, and they can't do a lot of things that people can do. But with our BrainGate participants, with their consent and when they're interested in taking part in different neuroscientific studies, we're able to do experiments that give us real insight as to how the brain actually does the things that it does. And so a lot of the neuroscientific inquiries that we've conducted over the years have been specifically designed to answer questions that allow us to make the technology work better. So understanding how human motor cortex encodes movement allows us to make better decoders, which allows us to make more efficient systems that work more accurately. But we have to do the neuroscientific work along the way. I'll skip over the actual study, again, just for the sake of time. And instead, I will take the remainder of the hour for questions, because I've seen the chat windows popped up a lot. If anyone is interested in learning more, before I do that, braingate.org is our website. You can email clinicaltrials@braingate.org, and you will get me, or you can email me directly. I'm drubin4@mgh.harvard.edu. But regardless, if you have any questions about the work that I presented, and I'll take some questions now. I see the chat's been lighting up. But if questions come up later, or if you think you might be interested in learning more about participating, please shoot me an email and I'll get back to you right away. And I will pause here and I will pull up the chat if I can. I think I'll stop, I'm gonna leave my slides on in case I can answer any questions with the slide, but let me, or if someone wants to throw some questions out from the chat, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin. I mean, this is truly just unbelievable technology. So thank you for sharing this. It really blows my mind. So let's see here. There are a couple questions. One question, does this technology of decoding speech also apply to people with dementia who've lost the ability to speak?
That is a great question. The answer to that is, I'm trying to find the right way to say maybe, but I guess I'll just say maybe. So it sort of depends. So people can lose the ability to speak from dementia for a number of different reasons. Some people lose the ability to speak because of an inability to coordinate the movement needed to generate speech. So there are certain conditions like PSP, or progressive supranuclear palsy, which causes, in some people, not everybody, but in some people causes dementia and also causes the loss of the ability to speak. And in these people, the loss of speech is probably due to loss of motor control. And these are people who we may be able to help by listening to the primary motor cortex, the area of the brain that controls the output to the motor structures for in absence of these systems. There are other people who develop, for example, something called primary progressive aphasia, or there are certain forms of Alzheimer's that also cause aphasia, which is a loss not so much of speech but of language. And there the answer is sort of uncertain. So there's people who lose the ability to speak without developing weakness, and there it's a loss of language, and it's not clear that this technology, in the way that we're currently formulating it, would be able to restore speech. It might, but we just don't know. We've never worked with anyone who's lost speech from that sort of condition. So it's not clear that the signals that we record from are still going to have the same information in them. But it's a great question. And again, it would really come down to, it'd be a case-by-case situation depending on what was the cause of the dementia and what did the loss of speech look like. I think would be the most accurate way to describe it. Oh, I think either you might be muted or I lost my sound.
Nope, I'm muted. You'd think after so many years I'd have this down. Another question. I have limited arm mobility. Will the arm device help me in the future? So kind of to piggyback off of that too, like where do you see this going in the future? And is it going to be more accessible to the general audience?
Absolutely, that's a great question. I see this going in two big directions. One is I think that this technology, so right now we are developing this technology with the unbelievable help of our research participants. So these are people with neuromuscular disease, spinal cord injury, stroke, but in general with very severe paralysis. And in order to be eligible to enroll, because it's a clinical trial, we require that people have severe paralysis, mainly from an ethical basis involving the sort of risks of being involved and things of that nature. But we envision this being technology that's going to be helpful for a much wider array of both conditions and severity of those conditions. So as our decoders improve, as the technology becomes more efficient, accurate, as it becomes smaller. So I haven't spent very little time describing the engineering work that's going into taking this from a big rack of computers into a tiny little box that you could, for example, mount on a wheelchair or something like that. So as this technology improves, we envision that the potential for helping people is going to be much wider. So people who, for example, have had a stroke and have lost the ability to use one of their arms or lost the ability to have good control of one of their arms. Well, right now we'd say, well, we don't work with people at the moment who have only weakness on one side of their body, but there's nothing about the technology that would prevent us from being able to do that. The other big area that I think is going to be huge that some groups are already exploring, ours isn't, but we're nearing there, is for the use of this technology in rehab and recovery. So, for example, there are certain types of strokes that people recover from, but not very, very much. So someone could have a stroke, have severe weakness on one side, and then recover, say, 50%. But there's reason to believe that using this technology in the right way could improve recovery by providing feedback. So if you had a device that not only read out the neural activity, but also provided some input to nearby brain circuits to help them recover quicker, that could increase both the rate of recovery after stroke as well as the amount of recovery. So to reach a higher plateau, if you will, of recovery. So the short answer is I hope so. I hope that limited arm mobility, I mean, one of the big areas of research is in restoring gait as well, which is much more complicated than I think a lot of people give it credit for. I mean, a lot of our work so far has been done using the arm, mainly because it's safer to work on the arm. You don't have to worry about someone falling over. But there's, it's going to be a huge achievement when we're able to use this to help people regain the ability to walk. And there, it's just going to be a matter of time.
Thank you. Another question here. Does this technology help to understand what is happening in the brain neurotransmitters balance, say with auditory hallucinations, which is atypical?
Sure, that's another really great question, and it sort of gets at the section that I skipped over, just for the sake of time, which is getting at some of these neuroscientific questions. So there's a huge area of research within sort of circuit neuroscience, understanding neuromodulation, which is to say the effect that different neurotransmitters have on the brain's electrical activity. So we're looking at the electrical activity. We can't, with this technology, measure things like neurotransmitter levels. That's just not something that this technology or really any real-time technology can do. But what we're able to do by looking at the electrical activity is see how it's changed in different contexts. And there's a lot of thought that a lot of these contextual modulations. So, for example, one could do the same movement, moving your arm out to pick up a water bottle versus moving your arm to pick up a cell phone. And it may be the same physical arm movements, but there's something different about the way that your hand approaches them, what happens when you pick it up. The example that some people can relate to is the notion you see a big suitcase sitting on the ground and you think it's going to be really heavy and you put your hand on it to pick it up and then you pick it up, it turns out it's empty. And all of a sudden your hand flies up and you're totally surprised and there's this sort of subconscious almost shock, an error signal in the brain saying, oh, I did this wrong. Oh, and then you quickly adjust and then you're carrying the suitcase and it's fine. Although there are certain neurologic conditions that make it harder to make those adjustments on the fly. So those are sort of contextual changes that are likely governed by different levels of neurotransmitters and neuromodulatory transmitters in particular in different brain circuits. And we can probably begin to understand a lot about how that works through experiments using this sort of technology. We don't get it things like auditory hallucinations, and that's really just because we're not recording from the right part of the brain. So these same sort of sensors, if placed in the auditory cortex, part of the temporal lobe, could probably begin to understand those And we do some collaboration with researchers who do more acute recording. So separate from the work that we do, these same sort of sensors are commonly used in neurosurgical practice when people with epilepsy are undergoing evaluation for epilepsy surgery. And so there may be the potential to learn about things like hallucinations, but we haven't approached that with our approach just because we're not putting the sensors in the right place.
This is so complex. It's amazing all the different avenues that this could take to really bring to light a lot of different things. So amazing work. I had a question. Could you
Please.
talk a little bit about the actual like procedure for having this put in? Like, what does that look
Sure.
like?
Absolutely. So I will, let's see if I can go back to my slide. And I'm gonna go back to, I think I've got a picture towards the beginning that'll sort of help. I will add, as I'm finding the right slide, I am not a neurosurgeon. I work closely with the neurosurgeons. Um, and so I'm describing what the neurosurgeons do. So when someone joins us in the trial and they say, I'd like to enroll in your trial, okay. Uh, they go through, we have a very long consent process. We describe all of the risks in exquisite detail. They undergo an MRI, so we have a good sense before we even go to the operating room of where to put the sensor. And then when they join us, we schedule a date. We go to the operating room. The person undergoes anesthesia, of course. A small craniotomy is performed, which is to say a small bit of the skull is opened, and the dura, which is the covering the brain, is open as well. The neurosurgeon looks at the surface of the brain, has one of these tiny little sensors here. Everything is, of course, completely sterile. It's an operating room. We spend a very, very long time comparing the image that the neurosurgeon is seeing in this camera so that everyone in the operating room, including the research team, can see everything that the surgeon sees. We all agree on the correct placement. The surgeon very delicately places the sensor on the motor cortex where we want the sensor to go. And then there's a special device that's got a little pneumatic trigger on it that basically presses the electrode array onto the surface of the brain with a very precise amount of pressure, not too soft, because you don't want the device to fall off, but not too hard because you don't want to damage the cortex. And then once that's done, these little wires sort of come out to the side, attached to this pedestal, which is outside of the skull. And then the surgeon closes everything up, closes up the dura, which is that covering, puts the piece of skull back on, stitches everything back together, and the person leaves the operating room a couple of hours later with one of these little pedestals protruding through the skin. And that's about it. And then we watch you in the hospital for usually a day or two, and then you go home. And that's sort of the extent of it. It's brain surgery, of course, and so I don't want to minimize that. But in the grand scheme of brain surgeries, it's hard to describe something as a less intense brain surgery. It's still a brain surgery, but that's sort of all that goes into it. Plus, decades of training that gives you the ability to do that safely. But that's for the surgeon.
Amazing. Looks like there's one more question that came in. How might this technology help an adult that lives with Duchenne muscular dystrophy? Have you had any experience with working with Duchenne patients at all?
So we have not yet had anyone with Duchenne's enroll in the study, but I anticipate that this would be able to help someone with an adult with Duchenne's, much the way it would help one of our participants with advanced ALS or other neuromuscular conditions. So if that person has developed difficulty with communication and is using either a letterboard or eye gaze, this could give them the ability to communicate quickly. The motor cortex, in the same way someone with a spinal cord injury or brainstem stroke, the motor cortex, the part of the brain that generates the intention to move, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and ALS and all these conditions, is completely intact and is perfectly healthy. The challenge is that it's either disconnected from the muscles in the condition of in the case of ALS, or it's attached to the muscles, but the muscles themselves don't work the way that they're supposed to in the case of muscular dystrophy. But the signals that the brain generates are the same as in someone without a neuromuscular condition. And so we can use the technology the same way to, again, restore mobility. I haven't shown videos, but things like controlling your powered wheelchair, controlling robotic arms. It's very easy to imagine how these same sort of control signals can be wired up to control a smart home. So control the lights, control music, control electric doors around around one's home. So in the not too distant future, we can imagine being able to use this technology and give someone who maybe was losing the ability to live independently, maintain that, so people don't have to leave their home, which I think would be a really meaningful impact for a lot of people too.
I think that is a great note to end on. Some great kind of hope for patients. So thank you, Dr. Rubin.